The conservators arrived in winter, their tools wrapped in cloth to protect surfaces worth more than small nations. They were there to restore something that had already been restored too many times, gilding that concealed cracks, marble that hid rot, a facade maintained at enormous cost by people who no longer understood what it was originally built to prove. Marble House stands today on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, its white columns facing the Atlantic as they have since 1892. Tourists pass through on timed rotations. The velvet ropes are new, installed to protect floors that once bore the weight of an empire. But empires do not survive by preservation. They survive by extraction, by consumption, by the violent belief that wealth justifies its own existence. Marble House was not built to last. It was built to dominate, to announce the arrival of Alva Vanderbilt as something more than rich, something closer to royalty in a republic that had no formal throne. 50 rooms. $500,000 in marble alone. A temple to excess disguised as a summer cottage. What remains now is not power. It is the architecture of power, hollowed out and monetized, its ballrooms silent except for the shuffle of paying guests. The house survived its builders. That was never the plan. The admission is $32. Children under 6 enter free, though there are few children. The docents wear badges and carry radios. They speak in practiced cadences about square footage, construction costs, and the provenance of furniture that was never meant to be examined this closely. The tour lasts 45 minutes. Photography is permitted in most rooms, prohibited in others. The gift shop sells postcards, books about the Gilded Age, and small reproductions of objects that were once functional and are now merely symbolic. This is Marble House in 2025, a property of the Preservation Society of Newport County, operated as a historic house museum, financially self-sustaining through ticket sales, event rentals, and the licensing of its image to production companies filming period dramas that require backdrops of authentic wealth. The language surrounding the house is careful. It is described as a summer cottage, a term that flattens what it actually was. Cottages suggest modesty, seasonal use, a kind of charming impermanence. Marble House was none of these things. It contains 50 rooms spread across 3 floors. The exterior is clad in marble shipped from quarries in Africa and Europe. The interior includes a ballroom modeled after Versailles, a dining room lined with Numidian marble, and a library designed to evoke a French chateau that no Vanderbilt had ever occupied. The servants' quarters, now closed to the public, housed a rotating staff of 60 during the summer season. There was nothing modest about this. There was nothing seasonal in its ambition. It was built to announce permanence in a society that had no formal aristocracy and thus required architecture to do the work that bloodlines could not. But permanence requires maintenance, and maintenance requires either wealth or reinvention. The Preservation Society acquired Marble House in 1963 for $85,000, a sum that sounds absurd until one considers what it represented, the desperation of heirs who could no longer afford to live in monuments to their ancestors. The house had become unsellable as a residence. It was too large, too expensive, too inflexible. Its plumbing was outdated. Its heating system was inadequate. Its property taxes were punitive. The only buyers willing to engage were developers interested in demolition, or preservationists willing to accept the burden of maintaining something that had outlived its original purpose. The Preservation Society chose the latter. They did not do this out of sentimentality. They did it because Marble House, like the other estates along Bellevue Avenue, had become a kind of intellectual property, a brand, a setting, a symbol that could be monetized through controlled access. The economic model is straightforward. Maintain the facade. Curate the narrative. Sell tickets. Rent the space for weddings, film shoots, private events. Allow the public to move through rooms that were designed to exclude them, and charge them for the privilege. It is preservation, but it is also extraction. The house survives not because it matters, but because it earns. The visitors do not seem to notice this. They move through the gold room, the Gothic room, the Chinese tea house built on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. They take photographs of themselves in front of gilded mirrors, marble columns, frescoed ceilings. They marvel at the excess, the scale, the sheer cost of it all. But they do not live here. They cannot sit in the chairs or open the drawers or sleep in the beds. The velvet ropes ensure that. So does the alarm system, the surveillance cameras, the docents who circulate with quiet authority. What they see is not a house. It is a stage set for a performance that ended decades ago. The furniture remains, but it is no longer furniture in any functional sense. It is artifact. The paintings hang in their original positions, but they are no longer decoration. They are inventory. The marble floors are protected by runners that guide foot traffic in predetermined patterns, ensuring that wear is distributed evenly, that no single section degrades faster than another. This is not how floors were used when the house was occupied. Then, they bore the weight of movement without consideration, servants crossing at speed, guests lingering in conversation, children running despite instruction. The house absorbed this. It was built to. Now it cannot afford to. The distinction matters. A house in use is a living system. It adapts, it degrades, it is repaired in response to need rather than schedule. A house as museum is something else entirely. It is frozen at a moment that never actually existed, a composite of periods, restorations, and curatorial decisions about what should be emphasized and what should be hidden. The Preservation Society has made choices. Certain rooms are furnished to reflect 1892, the year Alva Vanderbilt first occupied the house. Others reflect later periods, after her divorce, after her remarriage, after the suffrage meetings held in the Chinese tea house. The narrative presented to visitors is coherent, but it is not neutral. It emphasizes spectacle over function, wealth over labor, the visible over the structural. The servants' quarters are not part of the tour. Neither are the kitchens, the laundry rooms, the narrow staircases that allowed staff to move through the house without being seen. These spaces exist, but they are not accessible. They do not photograph well. They complicate the story. The Preservation Society is not hiding them, exactly, but they are not prioritizing them either. The focus is on the rooms that justify the admission price, the spaces where power was performed, where money became spectacle, where Alva Vanderbilt could stand in her gold room and believe, even temporarily, that she had escaped the limitations of her origins. But origins do not disappear. They accumulate. Marble House was built with Vanderbilt money, which was railroad money, which was labor extracted from workers who had no choice but to accept the terms offered. The marble came from quarries worked by men whose names are not recorded. The bronze grills were cast in Parisian foundries by craftsmen who were paid for skill, not credited for authorship. The furniture was made in workshops that no longer exist. Every object in the house represents a chain of labor that ends in anonymity. The tourists do not see this. They see only the final product, severed from its origins, polished into something that appears inevitable rather than constructed. This is what preservation does. It isolates the outcome from the process. It presents wealth as aesthetic rather than systemic. It allows visitors to admire without implicating themselves, to marvel without asking where the money came from or what it cost. The house becomes neutral, historical, safely distant from the mechanisms that created it. But the mechanisms have not disappeared. They have only changed form. Marble House still requires labor, groundskeepers, conservators, docents, security personnel. They are paid wages, not salaries. They do not live on the property. They arrive in the morning and leave in the evening, maintaining a building that exists to prove that some people once lived so far beyond necessity that necessity itself became invisible. The house survived. That fact is repeated often, usually with a tone of triumph. But survival is not the same as continuity. What survives is structure, not purpose. Marble House was built to dominate, to exclude, to assert Alva Vanderbilt's arrival among people who believed she did not belong. It succeeded, briefly. Then it became something else, a liability, a burden, a property too expensive to occupy and too visible to demolish. Now it is a museum. The tourists pay to enter. The docents explain the provenance. The gift shop closes at 5. This is not what Alva intended, but it is what remains. Newport had always been useful. Before it became a proving ground for industrial fortunes, it served as a colonial port, then a naval outpost, then a modest summer retreat for Quaker merchants seeking relief from Philadelphia's humid months. The houses built during that earlier era were wooden, practical, designed for temporary occupation by families who understood the difference between residence and display. They did not announce themselves. They did not need to. The people who built them already belonged to something, a mercantile class with established networks, inherited businesses, social positions secured through marriage and religious affiliation. Wealth, in that context, was assumed rather than demonstrated. It did not require architecture to prove itself. That changed after the Civil War. The war had accelerated industrial consolidation in ways that peacetime could not have achieved. Railroads expanded across territories that had been contested, now unified under federal authority. Steel production increased to meet demand for infrastructure that would connect markets previously isolated by geography. Fortunes were made not gradually, over generations, but rapidly, within decades, sometimes within years. The men who made them, Vanderbilt, Astor, Belmont, Morgan, did not inherit their positions. They seized them. They were not aristocrats. They were capitalists, and capitalism in America had no formal hierarchy, no inherited titles, no mechanism for transforming money into legitimacy except through the simulation of aristocracy itself. Newport became the site of that simulation. By the 1880s, the modest wooden houses had been joined by something else entirely, stone palaces designed to evoke European precedent, built on lots purchased at prices that reflected not land value but social ambition. The architectural language was deliberate: French chateaux, Italian villas, English manor houses, all transplanted to a narrow peninsula on the Rhode Island coast. The references were imported wholesale because American architectural vocabulary had no equivalent. There was no native tradition of dynastic wealth, no visual language for expressing permanence in a republic founded on the rejection of inherited privilege. So the new rich borrowed it, commissioned it, paid architects to design structures that would suggest bloodlines they did not have and histories they could not claim. This was not about comfort. The houses were often uncomfortable, drafty in winter, inadequately ventilated in summer, requiring enormous staffs to maintain systems that were never designed for efficiency. It was about presence. A house on Bellevue Avenue was a statement of arrival, a claim that the family who built it had transcended the taint of their origins. It did not matter that the Vanderbilt fortune came from shipping and railroads, industries associated with labor disputes, political corruption, and the kind of ruthless competition that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. What mattered was that the house looked like it had always been there, like it belonged to people who had always had money, like it was the natural residence of a family whose position was unquestionable. The performance required precision. Every detail had to align: the correct architect, the correct materials, the correct historical references. Mistakes were punished socially. A house that appeared too commercial, too modern, too obviously new, marked its owner as someone still striving rather than someone who had arrived. The goal was to appear effortless, to suggest that this level of wealth was simply the natural state of things, inherited rather than extracted, refined rather than raw. The Newport season became a theater for this performance, 8 weeks each summer when families opened their houses, hosted dinners, attended balls, and competed to demonstrate that their claim to permanence was more convincing than anyone else's. But permanence is not achieved through performance. It is achieved through systems, inheritance laws, marriage alliances, political influence, control of capital across generations. The European aristocracies that Newport architects referenced had those systems. They had lasted centuries not because their houses were beautiful, but because their wealth was protected by legal structures that prevented its dispersal. American law did not provide those protections. Fortunes could be divided among heirs, dissipated through bad marriages, lost through speculation. The houses could not fix that. They could only obscure it, temporarily. The performance worked as long as the money lasted, as long as the generation that built the houses remained alive to enforce the fiction. But fiction requires belief, and belief requires maintenance. The children of railroad barons did not build railroads. They inherited dividends. The grandchildren inherited less. The great-grandchildren inherited houses they could not afford to heat. This was already visible in the 1880s, even as construction accelerated. The first generation knew what they were doing. They understood that the houses were tools, that Newport was a mechanism for securing social position that would translate into business advantage, marriage alliances, political access. Alva Vanderbilt understood this perfectly. So did Caroline Astor, who used her position to control admission to New York society through the deliberate manipulation of guest lists, invitations, and the 400 people she deemed worthy of recognition. The houses were stages for that control. They provided the setting where power could be performed in ways that made it appear natural, inherited, unchallengeable. But the second generation did not understand this the same way. They inherited houses that were already built, social positions that were already established, money that appeared to replenish itself without effort. They did not see the violence that had produced it, the labor strike suppressed, the competitors destroyed, the political machinery that protected monopolies from regulation. They saw only the result: summer houses, yachts, servants, the endless choreography of leisure. They assumed it would continue because it always had, in their experience. They did not recognize that their experience was not historical precedent but historical anomaly, a brief moment when industrial capitalism produced fortunes large enough to simulate aristocracy without the legal structures that made aristocracy durable. Newport encouraged that delusion. The physical environment reinforced it. Walking through the grounds of these estates, one could believe in permanence. The stone was solid. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The gardens were maintained by professionals who understood horticulture as a science. Everything suggested durability, stability, the kind of rootedness that comes from centuries of occupation. But the roots were shallow. Most of these families had been in Newport less than a generation. The Vanderbilts arrived in the 1880s. The Belmonts shortly after. The Astors had a longer history, but even that stretched back only to the early 19th century, recent by European standards, recent even by American standards if one measured from colonial settlement rather than industrial accumulation. The language used to describe Newport reflected this tension. The houses were called cottages, a term borrowed from English aristocratic understatement, where massive country estates were referred to casually to signal that they were merely one property among many. But the American families using this language did not have country estates in multiple locations. They had one house in New York, one house in Newport, perhaps a yacht. The affectation was transparent, but it was socially necessary. To call these structures what they actually were, palaces, monuments, temples to industrial extraction, would have exposed the performance. So they remained cottages, and the families who built them remained new, no matter how much marble they imported or how many European craftsmen they employed. This is what made Newport different from the European models it referenced. In Europe, the great houses were embedded in systems of land tenure, political authority, and social obligation that extended beyond the individual family. A French chateau was not just a residence. It was the administrative center of an estate that generated income, employed tenants, and functioned as part of a regional economy. The English country house operated similarly, tied to agricultural land, connected to political representation, maintained through systems that distributed both wealth and responsibility across generations. These structures were exploitative, certainly, but they were also systemic. They lasted because they were integrated into broader networks of power that survived individual families. Newport had none of that. The houses generated no income. They were purely consumptive, requiring constant infusions of capital to maintain without producing anything in return except social position. There were no tenants, no agricultural land, no political obligations. The wealth that sustained them came from elsewhere, from railroad dividends, from mining operations in the West, from banks in New York. The houses were disconnected from the economic systems that made them possible, beautiful parasites drawing resources from industrial networks that operated thousands of miles away. This made them vulnerable in ways their owners did not yet understand. When the systems changed, when the railroads were regulated, when fortunes contracted, the houses would not adapt. They would simply become too expensive to justify, monuments to a brief moment when new money believed it could purchase permanence through architecture alone. Alva Erskine Smith was born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, into a family that understood social position as something distinct from wealth. Her father was a cotton merchant, successful enough to maintain appearances but not wealthy enough to be secure. The family had connections, Southern, established, the kind of lineage that mattered in a region where ancestry determined access. But the Civil War destroyed that framework. The cotton economy collapsed. The systems that had sustained families like the Smiths disintegrated. What remained was memory, the knowledge of what position had once meant, and the understanding that it would have to be rebuilt through different means. The family moved to New York in the 1860s, joining the migration of Southerners who recognized that the center of American power had shifted north. New York after the war was not the same city it had been before. It was louder, faster, more crowded, dominated by men who had made fortunes supplying the Union Army or expanding the infrastructure that would connect a reunified nation. The old Knickerbocker families, Dutch descendants who had controlled the city's social hierarchy for generations, still occupied their positions, but they were under pressure from newcomers who had money and wanted recognition. The city's social structure was contested in ways that Southern society, even in collapse, had never been. Alva learned to navigate this. She was educated in France, an experience that gave her fluency in the cultural references that American wealth aspired to but rarely understood. She spoke French. She knew European architecture, painting, decorative arts. She understood that American plutocrats were attempting to purchase legitimacy through association with European forms, but that most of them lacked the knowledge to do it convincingly. This gap represented opportunity. If she could not inherit position, she could construct it, and construction required specific skills, the ability to identify which references mattered, which architects could execute them, which social rituals would signal belonging rather than aspiration. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875. He was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who had built the family fortune through shipping and railroads using methods that were effective but not respectable. Cornelius had been ruthless, litigious, willing to crush competitors through rate wars and political manipulation. He died in 1877 worth over $100 million, but he died without social acceptance. The Vanderbilt money was too new, too visibly tied to labor disputes and monopolistic practices, too associated with the kind of industrial violence that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. The family was rich but not established. They were invited to some events but excluded from others. They could buy property but not position. Alva saw this as a problem that could be solved. William was not ambitious in the way she was. He had inherited wealth and seemed content to manage it without seeking transformation. But Alva was not content. She had grown up understanding that position could be lost, that security required constant reinforcement, that the appearance of permanence was more important than permanence itself. The Vanderbilt fortune gave her resources. What it lacked was strategy. Her first move was architectural. In 1879, she convinced William to commission a house at 660 Fifth Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the style of a French chateau. The house was enormous, ostentatious, filled with imported materials and historical references that announced the Vanderbilts as patrons of culture rather than accumulators of capital. The New York press mocked it initially, too grand, too European, too obviously an attempt to purchase status. But Alva understood that mockery was temporary. What mattered was presence. The house occupied space that could not be ignored. It forced New York society to acknowledge the Vanderbilts every time they passed it on Fifth Avenue. The second move was social. In 1883, Alva organized a costume ball at the Fifth Avenue house, carefully structured to force Caroline Astor's hand. Astor controlled New York society through exclusion, determining who belonged through the deliberate limitation of her guest list of 400 people, the number her ballroom could accommodate. Alva's daughter Consuelo wanted to attend the ball, but the Astors had not formally recognized the Vanderbilts, which meant Consuelo could not be invited. Astor's daughter wanted to attend. The impasse was deliberate. Alva forced Astor to choose, maintain the exclusion and have her daughter excluded in return, or acknowledge the Vanderbilts and allow both daughters to participate. Astor capitulated. She paid a formal call on Alva, the social ritual that signified recognition. The Vanderbilts were admitted. The ball proceeded. 1,200 guests attended, dressed in costumes that required months of preparation and cost thousands of dollars. The event was covered extensively in the press, not as society news but as spectacle, a demonstration of wealth so excessive that it became its own justification. Alva had forced entry not through deference but through the deployment of resources so overwhelming that exclusion became untenable. This was her method. She did not ask for acceptance. She constructed situations where exclusion was more costly than admission. The Fifth Avenue house made the Vanderbilts unavoidable. The ball made their position undeniable. But position in New York was not the same as position in Newport, and Newport mattered differently. New York was commercial, contested, a city where fortunes were still being made and social hierarchies were negotiated daily. Newport was supposed to be settled, a summer retreat where established families performed leisure without the intrusion of business. To succeed there required a different approach, not spectacle, but the appearance of permanence. Marble House was designed to provide that. Alva commissioned Richard Morris Hunt again, but this time the reference was not French Baroque. It was classical, Greek and Roman forms filtered through French academic architecture, materials chosen for their association with antiquity and empire. The marble was Numidian, the same stone used in ancient temples. The proportions were monumental. The cost was $11 million, a sum that included not just construction but the complete furnishing of the interior with objects designed specifically for each room. Nothing was reused. Nothing was adapted. Every chair, every table, every bronze fixture was created to fit the space it would occupy, as if the house and its contents had emerged fully formed rather than assembled over 2 years of construction. This was intentional. European aristocratic houses accumulated objects over generations, inherited furniture, family portraits, collections built through centuries of acquisition. American houses could not replicate that history, so they simulated it through totalizing design, creating environments that appeared complete, finished, as if they had always existed in exactly this form. Marble House was not designed to evolve. It was designed to appear immutable, a structure that could have been built a century earlier or a century later without alteration, outside of time, exempt from the processes of change that affected ordinary buildings. Alva presented the house to William as a birthday gift in 1892, though the fiction was transparent. William had paid for it, but the vision was entirely hers. She had worked with Hunt on every detail, the layout, the materials, the symbolic program that governed the decoration. The Gold Room, modeled after Versailles, established her as a peer to Louis XIV, or at least to the architects who had served him. The dining room, lined with pink Numidian marble, evoked Roman imperial banquets. The library, paneled in walnut and filled with books she would never read, suggested intellectual refinement. Every room was a claim, a statement that the Vanderbilts had transcended their origins and arrived at a level of cultivation that required no further justification. But the house was also a weapon. It was larger than the Astor cottage. It was more expensive than the Belmont estate. It contained materials that other families had not thought to import and references that required European education to decode. Alva was not just building a residence. She was establishing dominance, proving that Vanderbilt money could purchase not just admission to Newport society but superiority within it. The house announced that she was no longer competing for position. She was defining what position meant. This strategy required her to inhabit the house in specific ways. She did not use it casually. She hosted dinners that were choreographed performances, guest lists that were strategic calculations, events that forced other families to attend or risk appearing irrelevant. The house became a stage, but Alva was not performing leisure. She was performing power, demonstrating that she controlled access, that invitations to Marble House mattered in ways that invitations to other houses did not. The architecture supported this. The scale intimidated. The materials impressed. The references excluded anyone who lacked the cultural literacy to understand what they were seeing. But power through architecture is inherently unstable. It depends on the willingness of others to accept the terms it establishes, to agree that marble equals legitimacy, that size equals importance, that European precedent justifies American wealth. Alva had forced that agreement in New York through the deployment of overwhelming resources. She attempted the same in Newport. For a decade, it worked. Marble House became the standard against which other houses were measured. Families who had built cottages in the 1880s began planning renovations, expansions, additions that would allow them to compete. The architectural language of Newport shifted, became grander, more expensive, more explicitly imperial. But Alva herself was already dissatisfied. She had achieved what she set out to achieve: social dominance, recognition, the transformation of Vanderbilt money into Vanderbilt position. The house had done its work. It had announced her arrival and secured her place. But arrival is not the same as purpose, and Marble House, for all its scale and expense, was still only a summer residence, occupied 8 weeks per year, maintained at enormous cost to host dinners and balls that followed scripts she had written years earlier. The performance had become routine. The power had become tedious. She had built a monument to permanence, but permanence, once achieved, revealed itself to be suffocating rather than liberating. Richard Morris Hunt did not invent the problem, but he understood how to solve it. The problem was simple: American fortunes had no history. They were raw, recent, visibly connected to industries that polite conversation avoided: railroads, steel mills, slaughterhouses, mines. The men who made these fortunes wanted them laundered through culture, transformed from capital into civilization. They needed someone who could translate money into forms that suggested it had always existed, that appeared inherited rather than extracted. Hunt provided that service. He did not call it that, but that is what it was. He had been trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to complete the program. The education was rigorous, focused on classical principles and historical styles, teaching architects to design buildings that referenced established forms rather than inventing new ones. The philosophy was conservative by intention. Architecture was not supposed to express novelty. It was supposed to express continuity, to connect the present to the past through visual language that made power appear natural and timeless. Hunt absorbed this completely. When he returned to America in 1855, he brought a vocabulary that American architects lacked and American plutocrats desperately needed. His early work was modest: commercial buildings, institutional projects, houses for clients who wanted competence rather than grandeur. But by the 1870s, the scale of available commissions had changed. The fortunes being made after the Civil War were unprecedented in American history, and the families making them wanted houses that matched their wealth. They did not want innovation. They wanted legitimacy, and legitimacy required reference to European precedent. Hunt could provide that. He knew which chateaux to reference, which palaces to evoke, which decorative programs communicated aristocratic refinement rather than commercial success. The Vanderbilts became his most important clients. William Kissam Vanderbilt's house on Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882, established Hunt's reputation as the architect who could make new money look old. The house was French Gothic, modeled after the Château de Blois, built with limestone imported from France and filled with decorative elements that required European craftsmen to execute. The cost was $3 million, an extraordinary sum, but the house achieved what it was designed to achieve. It looked like it belonged to a family with centuries of history, not decades. It suggested cultivation, refinement, a kind of effortless superiority that had nothing to do with railroads or the laborers who built them. Alva Vanderbilt understood what Hunt had done. She had seen how architecture could rewrite history, how a house could make claims that would be socially unacceptable if stated directly. When she decided to build in Newport, Hunt was the inevitable choice. But the commission for Marble House was different. The Fifth Avenue house had been designed to compete within an existing hierarchy, to force the Vanderbilts into a social structure that had excluded them. Marble House was designed to transcend that structure entirely, to establish a new standard that other families would have to meet or accept their inferiority. Hunt approached the project with that understanding. The style he chose was not Gothic or Baroque. It was neoclassical, referencing Greek temples and Roman villas filtered through the French academic tradition he had studied. The choice was deliberate. Gothic architecture suggested medieval lineage, aristocratic bloodlines, the kind of history American families could not claim. Neoclassical architecture suggested empire, power exercised through institutions rather than inheritance, civilization built through conquest and administration rather than genealogy. It was a language of dominance, not belonging. Alva did not want to belong. She wanted to dominate. The materials were selected to reinforce this. The exterior was clad entirely in white marble, shipped from quarries across Europe and Africa. Marble was expensive, difficult to work, and symbolically loaded. It was the material of temples, monuments, structures built to last millennia. Wood could rot. Brick could crumble. Marble endured. The choice announced permanence in the most literal terms possible. This house would outlast its builders, outlast their children, outlast the social structures it was designed to dominate. It would remain, a physical fact that could not be erased or ignored. The interior required even more precision. Hunt designed each room as a separate environment, a distinct historical reference executed with archaeological accuracy. The entrance hall evoked Greek temples, with yellow marble columns and a bronze and glass ceiling that filtered light into the space. The gold room was modeled after the Salon d'Hercule at Versailles, walls covered in gilded wood panels, ceiling painted with Baroque figures, furniture designed to match the opulence of Louis XIV court. The dining room used pink Numidian marble, the same stone quarried in North Africa for Roman imperial buildings. Every material had a precedent. Every reference had a source. Nothing was invented. Everything was cited. This was not decoration. It was argument. Each room made a claim about the Vanderbilts' position in relation to historical power. The Greek references connected them to the origins of Western civilization. The Roman materials linked them to empire. The French Baroque elements placed them in conversation with absolute monarchy. Hunt was not designing spaces for living. He was designing spaces for the performance of legitimacy, rooms that would convince visitors that the family who built this house occupied the same cultural and historical position as the emperors, kings, and aristocrats whose architectural languages had been appropriated. The execution required specialists. The bronze grilles in the entrance hall were cast in Paris by craftsmen who worked from Hunt's drawings but brought their own technical expertise. The marble work was done by Italian stonemasons who understood how to cut and fit stone with the precision necessary for classical proportions. The gilding in the gold room required artisans trained in techniques that had been developed in 18th-century France and transmitted through workshop tradition. Hunt coordinated all of this, managing logistics that stretched across continents, ensuring that materials arrived in sequence and that craftsmen understood how their work fit into the larger symbolic program. The cost became irrelevant. Alva had given Hunt a budget of $11 million, but the figure was less a constraint than a demonstration. Spending that much on a house occupied 8 weeks per year was not rational. It was expressive. It proved that the Vanderbilts had reached a level of wealth where cost no longer mattered, where money could be deployed purely for symbolic purposes without regard for return or utility. The house did not need to justify itself economically. It justified itself through presence, through the sheer fact of its existence. Hunt understood this, but he also understood the limitations. He was designing a simulation, not a reality. European palaces had been built over centuries, modified by successive generations, embedded in political and economic systems that extended beyond the buildings themselves. Marble House was built in 2 years. It had no history except the history Hunt invented through architectural reference. It had no function except the function Alva assigned to it. It was a monument to wealth, but wealth alone could not sustain the claims the house was making. It could only sustain the appearance of those claims, and appearance required constant maintenance, financial, social, performative. The house was completed in 1892. Hunt attended the opening, toured the rooms, received Alva's approval. He had done what she asked. He had created a structure that announced the Vanderbilts as equals to European aristocracy, a house that suggested permanence, cultivation, and power exercised so naturally that it required no justification. But Hunt was also aware of what he had built. He had spent years studying European architecture, visiting the chateaux and palaces that Marble House referenced. He knew that those buildings had survived not because they were beautiful, but because they were protected by systems, legal structures that prevented the division of estates, political positions that generated income, social networks that reinforced power across generations. America had none of those protections. Fortunes could be lost through speculation, divided among heirs, dissipated through divorce or poor management. Houses could become liabilities. Marble House cost $11 million to build, but it would cost hundreds of thousands annually to maintain. The staff alone required enormous expenditure, 60 people during the summer season, smaller crews during winter to prevent decay. The heating system was inadequate for year-round use. The plumbing was complex and prone to failure. The marble required specialized cleaning. The gilding required periodic restoration. Every element that made the house impressive also made it expensive. Hunt did not discuss these concerns with Alva. That was not his role. He was hired to design legitimacy, and he had delivered. But he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that the houses he built for American plutocrats were fundamentally different from the European models they referenced. They were not embedded in systems that would ensure their survival. They were isolated monuments, dependent entirely on the continued wealth of the families who built them. If that wealth contracted, if the railroads were regulated, if inheritance taxes were introduced, the houses would become unsustainable. They would survive only as long as someone was willing to pay for their maintenance, and maintenance without purpose was a luxury even the very rich would eventually abandon. He designed one more house for the Vanderbilts after Marble House, Biltmore, an estate in North Carolina even larger and more expensive. George Washington Vanderbilt, William's brother, wanted a country house modeled after French chateaux, surrounded by managed forests and agricultural land. Hunt designed it, supervised construction, saw it completed. He died in 1895, 3 years after Marble House opened. By then, he had created the architectural language that defined the Gilded Age, houses that looked like they belonged to dynasties but were actually monuments to extraction, structures that suggested permanence but were dependent on systems that could not last. He built what his clients asked for. He did not promise that it would endure. The house operated on schedules. The staff arrived in May, weeks before the family, to prepare rooms that had been closed since the previous September. Dust covers were removed from furniture. Chandeliers were cleaned, each crystal piece inspected for damage. Carpets were beaten, windows washed, marble floors polished until they reflected light without streaks. The work was repetitive, intensive, and invisible by design. When the Vanderbilts arrived in mid-June, the house was supposed to appear as if it had been waiting for them in perfect condition, as if no labor had been required to maintain it. 60 people worked in rotation to sustain this fiction. The hierarchy was rigid. At the top, a butler managed the male staff and controlled access to the family. A housekeeper supervised the female staff and maintained household inventory. Below them, footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, groundskeepers, each with specific duties that did not overlap. A footman did not clean. A maid did not serve. The separation was enforced through uniforms, through separate staircases, through dining arrangements that replicated the social distances they were employed to maintain. The kitchens were located in the basement, connected to the dining room by a dumbwaiter and a service staircase that allowed staff to move food without being seen. Meals were prepared on coal-fired stoves by a chef and 2 assistants, timed to arrive at the table at precise intervals determined by the rhythm of formal dining. Courses were served in sequence: soup, fish, entree, roast, salad, dessert, each accompanied by specific wines chosen to complement the food and demonstrate the family's access to European imports. A typical dinner required 3 hours. The staff worked throughout, moving between kitchen and dining room, clearing plates, refilling glasses, presenting dishes on silver platters that were polished daily. The choreography extended beyond meals. Morning routines required maids to enter bedrooms while the family slept, lighting fires in winter, opening curtains in summer, laying out clothes selected the night before. Bathwater was drawn at specified temperatures. Breakfast trays were delivered at specified times. The family did not adjust their schedules to accommodate the staff. The staff adjusted their schedules to remain invisible, present only when needed, absent otherwise. The system worked because everyone involved understood their position within it. The family assumed service. The staff provided it. The house made both possible. This was not unique to Marble House. Every estate on Bellevue Avenue operated similarly, competing not just through architecture but through the precision of their household management. The quality of service became another metric of status, another way families demonstrated their sophistication. A well-run house meant a competent staff, which meant careful hiring, adequate pay, and the enforcement of standards that left no room for improvisation. Servants who failed to meet those standards were replaced. The labor market in Newport was seasonal but deep, fed by workers who migrated from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to fill positions that lasted only 8 weeks but paid enough to sustain them through the off-season. The Vanderbilts paid well by contemporary standards, but pay was not the primary mechanism of control. Discipline was maintained through proximity, through the constant surveillance that came from living in a house where staff occupied the same physical space as the family but were socially invisible. Servants saw everything: private conversations, family arguments, the routines of dressing and undressing, the consumption of alcohol, the visits from guests who arrived late and left early. But they were expected to see nothing, to hear nothing, to remember nothing. Discretion was not optional. It was the condition of employment. The arrangement was exploitative in ways that were considered normal. Staff worked 16-hour days during the season, with 1 afternoon off per week. They ate meals in the servants' hall, separate from the family, food prepared from the same kitchens but served without ceremony. They slept in small rooms on the 3rd floor, furnished with beds and little else. There was no privacy, no space for personal effects beyond what could fit in a single trunk. The work was exhausting, physically demanding, socially isolating. But it was also stable, and stability mattered to people whose alternatives were factory labor or domestic service in less prestigious households where conditions were worse and pay was lower. The Vanderbilts occupied the house differently than the staff, but they too followed scripts. Mornings were private, breakfast in rooms, correspondence, preparations for the day's social obligations. Afternoons involved visiting, receiving guests, attending events at other estates or at the Newport Casino, the exclusive club where families gathered for tennis, lawn parties, and carefully orchestrated encounters. Evenings centered on dinners, either at Marble House or at other cottages, followed by balls, theater performances, or receptions that extended past midnight. The leisure was relentless. There was no space in the Newport season for idleness or spontaneity. Every day was filled with obligations that were presented as pleasures but functioned as work, the work of maintaining position, of demonstrating that the family belonged at this level, of performing the kind of effortless superiority that required constant effort to sustain. Alva managed this personally, controlling guest lists, approving menus, directing staff, ensuring that every event at Marble House reinforced the family's dominance. She did not delegate. She orchestrated. The gold room became the center of this performance. Designed to evoke Versailles, it was used for receptions where guests stood rather than sat, circulating through the space in patterns determined by social hierarchy. The most important guests received personal attention from Alva. Others were acknowledged briefly or ignored. The room itself did the work of intimidation, the gilded walls, the painted ceiling, the scale that made individuals feel small. Conversations were conducted under conditions that made privacy impossible and discretion essential. Everything said could be overheard. Everything done could be observed. The room was surveillance disguised as splendor. Dinners in the pink marble dining room followed similarly rigid protocols. Seating arrangements were calculated days in advance, based on rank, relationship, and strategic purpose. Men and women alternated. Married couples were separated. Guests of honor sat nearest to Alva and William, a positioning that communicated their importance to everyone else at the table. The meals themselves were secondary to the performance of dining, the correct use of silverware, the measured pace of conversation, the ability to eat elaborate food without appearing to exert effort. Mistakes were noticed. Competence was assumed. William participated in this, but he was not the architect of it. He attended dinners, hosted events, played the role assigned to him. But the ambition was Alva's. She had built Marble House to establish the Vanderbilts as superior to other Newport families, and she used the house to enforce that superiority through the meticulous control of social access. Invitations to Marble House mattered because she made them matter, because she turned the house into a venue where position was confirmed or denied, where families competed for recognition and Alva determined the winners. This system functioned effectively between 1892 and 1895. The house fulfilled its purpose. The Vanderbilts were not just accepted in Newport, they were dominant. Other families built larger houses, hosted more elaborate parties, but Marble House remained the standard, the house that others measured themselves against. Alva had achieved what she set out to achieve. She had transformed Vanderbilt money into Vanderbilt position, had forced a social structure that had excluded them to reorganize itself around their presence. But dominance at this level required more than architecture. It required sustained performance, year after year, season after season. It required the willingness to continue hosting dinners that followed scripts she had written, to continue managing staff who required constant supervision, to continue competing with families who were building their own monuments and demanding their own recognition. The house had done its work, but the work did not end. It simply became routine, and routine revealed what the performance had obscured, that power exercised through social dominance was tedious, that maintaining position required the endless repetition of rituals that no longer held meaning. By 1895, Alva was already planning her exit. She had grown dissatisfied with William, though dissatisfaction was perhaps too mild a term. The marriage had been strategic from the beginning, a means to access Vanderbilt money and the position it could purchase. She had used that access effectively, had built the houses, hosted the events, forced the recognitions that transformed her from a Southern refugee into a dominant figure in American society. But William himself had never been the point. He was a vehicle, and vehicles could be replaced. The decision to divorce was not impulsive. It was calculated with the same precision she had applied to everything else. Divorce in 1895 carried social penalties, but Alva had reached a position where those penalties no longer applied to her in the same way they would to other women. She had wealth. She had position. She had demonstrated that she could control access and define standards. A divorce would be scandalous, but scandal could be managed, could even be useful if it reinforced her willingness to operate outside conventional constraints. She filed for divorce in March 1895, citing adultery. The case was settled quickly, quietly, without the public spectacle that might have destroyed a family with less money or less control over the institutions that managed social reputation. William did not contest it. He paid what was required and withdrew. Alva retained Marble House, along with significant financial support that ensured her position would not be compromised by the end of the marriage. The house continued to operate. The staff remained. The summer season proceeded. But the purpose had shifted. Marble House was no longer a stage for performing marital respectability or family cohesion. It became something else, a headquarters, a platform for a project Alva had been developing quietly while still managing the social performance that had occupied the previous decade. She had grown interested in the women's suffrage movement, not as a theoretical commitment but as a practical mechanism for exercising power in ways that Newport society did not permit. The house would serve that purpose. The Gold Room would host meetings. The Chinese tea house on the cliffs would become a venue for organizing. Marble House, built to announce dominance within an established hierarchy, would be repurposed to challenge hierarchy itself. The performance was ending. The ideology was shifting. The house would adapt, because Alva demanded it. The Chinese tea house sat at the edge of the cliffs, a small structure separated from the main house by terraced gardens and a narrow path that descended toward the Atlantic. Alva had commissioned it as an afterthought during the original construction, a decorative pavilion where guests could take tea while observing the ocean. It was designed in the Orientalist style fashionable among wealthy Americans who collected Asian art without understanding its context: blue and white porcelain, carved woodwork, a roof that mimicked Chinese temple architecture filtered through European interpretation. The structure was charming, picturesque, structurally irrelevant to the main house. But after the divorce, it became useful in ways Alva had not originally anticipated. She began hosting meetings there in 1896. Small gatherings at first, women from Newport and New York who had expressed interest in suffrage but had no organizational framework to pursue it. The tea house provided a venue that was private without being clandestine, elegant without being intimidating, separate enough from the main house that the meetings could occur without disrupting the social functions that still required Marble House to operate as it always had. Alva had not abandoned Newport society. She had simply added another layer to her activities, another performance that required different staging. The meetings were not radical in the sense that term would later acquire. The women who attended were wealthy, educated, accustomed to managing households and organizing charitable events. They were not workers. They were not immigrants. They were members of the same class that controlled Newport, and their interest in suffrage emerged from that position rather than in opposition to it. They believed women of their standing should have political rights commensurate with their social and economic position. They were not arguing for universal suffrage. They were arguing for their own inclusion in a system they otherwise supported. Alva understood this perfectly. She was not a Democrat. She did not believe in equality as an abstract principle. But she believed in power, and she recognized that political disenfranchisement was a limitation on the power women like herself could exercise. She had spent 2 decades learning how to manipulate social hierarchies, how to force recognition through the strategic deployment of wealth and cultural capital. Suffrage represented an extension of that strategy into formal politics, a mechanism for converting social dominance into political authority. The movement did not threaten her position. It reinforced it. But it required organization, and organization required money. Alva had both. The divorce settlement had left her financially independent, with assets that generated income sufficient to fund activities that did not require William's approval or oversight. She contributed to suffrage organizations in New York and nationally, funded publications, paid for speaking tours, covered legal fees for activists who faced prosecution. The contributions were substantial but strategic, directed toward efforts that aligned with her vision of what suffrage should achieve: political rights for women who already held social and economic power, not transformation of the systems that created that power. The tea house became a symbol of this approach. It was beautiful, exclusive, located on property that represented the pinnacle of Gilded Age excess. The meetings held there were not open to the public. They were invitation only, attended by women who could afford to summer in Newport and had the leisure to dedicate time to political organizing. The movement they were building was elite by design, focused on securing rights for women of their class first, assuming that broader expansion would follow once precedent had been established. Whether that assumption was sincere or strategic remained ambiguous, but it shaped the organizing that emerged from Marble House during the late 1890s. Alva remarried in 1896, less than a year after the divorce. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was a banker, a member of an established New York family, a man whose social position equaled her own. The marriage was not a retreat into conventional domesticity. Belmont shared Alva's interest in suffrage, or at least did not oppose it, which was sufficient. He understood that Alva was not interested in performing the role of supportive wife. She had already performed that role with William, and it had served its purpose. This marriage was a partnership structured around mutual interest rather than social obligation. They maintained separate residences, spent time apart, pursued independent projects. The arrangement was unusual but not scandalous, at least not among people who had learned that Alva operated according to her own logic. Marble House remained hers, legally and practically. Belmont had his own estate in Newport, a house designed by Richard Morris Hunt in a different style, but he spent time at Marble House when Alva hosted events that required his presence. The house itself began to function differently. The Gold Room, which had been used for receptions that enforced social hierarchy, was now used for suffrage meetings that attracted journalists, activists, women who would not have been invited during the previous decade. The shift was deliberate. Alva was repurposing the architecture of exclusion into a platform for inclusion, at least inclusion of a particular kind. The meetings grew larger. By 1909, Alva was hosting conferences at Marble House that drew national attention. Speakers addressed audiences in the ballroom, standing beneath the gilded ceiling that had been designed to evoke Louis XIV court. The symbolism was layered, women demanding political rights in a room built to celebrate monarchy, using the wealth of industrial capitalism to fund a movement that challenged patriarchal control. Alva seemed to enjoy the contradiction, or at least to recognize its usefulness. The press covered the events extensively, not always sympathetically, but coverage mattered more than tone. Visibility was the point. She was not universally admired within the suffrage movement. Younger activists, particularly those organizing working-class women, viewed Alva with suspicion. She was wealthy, connected to families that had made fortunes through labor exploitation, using a house built by immigrant workers to host meetings about political rights. The hypocrisy was visible, but Alva did not address it. She operated from the position that wealth was a tool, that her resources allowed her to fund organizing that others could not, and that her social position gave her access to politicians and media that working-class activists lacked. The argument was pragmatic rather than principled. She was not interested in ideological purity. She was interested in results. Belmont died in 1908, leaving Alva a widow for the second time. She did not remarry. She had no need to. She had wealth, independence, a platform that allowed her to operate without requiring male approval or oversight. Marble House became even more central to her activities after Belmont's death. She spent more time there, extended the season beyond the traditional summer months, used the house year-round when necessary to accommodate organizing that did not conform to Newport's social calendar. The house staff adapted, maintaining the building through winters that were harsh and expensive, keeping rooms heated that were designed for summer occupancy, managing systems that had not been built for continuous use. The suffrage work intensified through the 1910s. Alva organized marches, funded lobbying efforts, testified before legislative committees. She was arrested once, in 1917, during a protest outside the White House, a calculated act of civil disobedience designed to generate publicity. The arrest was brief, the charges dismissed, but the event was covered nationally. Photographs of Alva in handcuffs circulated in newspapers, a wealthy woman who had built a palace in Newport now standing in a police station alongside activists from very different backgrounds. The image was useful, though it did not erase the class divisions that defined the movement. By 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, Alva had spent nearly 25 years funding and organizing suffrage efforts. She had contributed an estimated $1 million to the movement, an enormous sum that represented a significant portion of her personal wealth. She had used Marble House as a headquarters, a venue, a symbol of what wealthy women could accomplish when they deployed their resources strategically. The tea house had hosted hundreds of meetings. The Gold Room had been transformed from a space designed to enforce social hierarchy into one associated with political organizing. The house had been converted, not structurally but functionally, from a monument to excess into a platform for activism. But the conversion was always incomplete. Marble House never stopped being what it was, a palace built with Vanderbilt Railroad money, maintained by servants who had no political rights when the organizing began and whose working conditions were not improved by the movement Alva led. The suffrage work did not address this. It did not attempt to. Alva's vision of political rights was limited to women of her class, women who already exercised economic and social power and wanted formal political authority to match. The house reflected that limitation. It remained exclusive even as it hosted meetings about inclusion, remained expensive even as it funded a movement that claimed to represent all women. After 1920, the suffrage work ended. The goal had been achieved. Women could vote. Alva's role in securing that right was significant, though activists who had organized working-class women often received less recognition. She continued to live at Marble House through the 1920s, but the urgency that had driven the previous 2 decades was gone. The house returned to something closer to its original function, a summer residence, a venue for entertaining, a monument to Alva's position. The meetings stopped. The tea house became decorative again. The Gold Room hosted dinners rather than political organizing. She was elderly now, less interested in the social competition that had consumed her in the 1890s, less invested in maintaining the performance that Marble House had been built to support. The house still operated, still required staff, still cost enormous sums to maintain. But the purpose had become unclear. It was no longer a weapon. It was no longer a headquarters. It was simply a house, large and expensive and increasingly difficult to justify. Alva died in 1933, in Paris, far from Newport. She left instructions that her ashes be scattered at sea. She did not leave Marble House to her children. She left it to her friend, who sold it almost immediately. The conversion was over. The house would need to find another purpose, or it would not survive. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt inherited Marble House in 1940, though inheritance was perhaps the wrong term for receiving something no one wanted. He was William K. Vanderbilt's grandson, a man who had grown up surrounded by the estates his family had built but who understood that those estates represented liabilities rather than assets. He was a yachtsman, a bridge player, a cultivated man who had been educated at Harvard and had spent his life managing Vanderbilt investments rather than expanding them. The fortune was still substantial, but it was contracting. Railroad revenues had declined as automobiles became common and federal regulation limited the monopolistic practices that had made the original fortune possible. The money that remained was enough to live well, but not enough to maintain houses that required staffs of 60 and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in upkeep. Harold had never lived at Marble House. Neither had his father, William K. Vanderbilt II, who had inherited the house from Alva through a series of transactions that reflected familial obligation rather than desire. The younger William had his own estate in Long Island, a house more suited to his interests in marine biology and automotive racing. Marble House sat largely vacant after Alva's death, opened briefly during summers when staff were hired to air out rooms and maintain systems that degraded rapidly without use. The house was structurally sound but operationally inert, a monument without occupants, expensive to maintain and impossible to sell. Harold understood the problem. The Newport cottage era had ended, not dramatically but through a slow recognition that houses of this scale no longer made economic sense. Property taxes had increased as towns needed revenue for public services. Income taxes, introduced in 1913 and expanded during the World Wars, reduced the capital available for maintaining private estates. Servants became harder to hire as alternative employment opportunities opened, particularly for women who had historically filled domestic positions. The labor that had made houses like Marble House functional was disappearing, and without that labor, the houses could not operate as designed. Other families faced the same calculation. Some demolished their cottages, selling the land for subdivision. Others converted them to institutional uses, clubs, schools, convents. A few attempted to maintain them as private residences, but the costs were prohibitive. By the 1940s, Bellevue Avenue was lined with houses that were closed year-round, their windows shuttered, their grounds minimally maintained, their interiors slowly accumulating the damage that comes from disuse. Marble House was among them, a structure that had been built to announce permanence now demonstrating the opposite, that permanence required resources no individual family could sustainably provide. Harold visited occasionally, walking through rooms that were still furnished but felt increasingly like stage sets. The gold room remained gilded, but the gilt showed signs of deterioration where moisture had penetrated the walls. The marble floors were intact but dulled from lack of polishing. The furniture was covered in dust sheets that were removed only when potential buyers toured the property, and potential buyers were rare. Who would purchase a house with 50 rooms that could not be heated economically, that required a staff no longer available, that represented a way of life that had become not just expensive but incomprehensible? The question was not rhetorical. Harold spent the 1940s attempting to answer it, consulting with real estate agents, architects, anyone who might suggest a viable use for the property. The suggestions were impractical. A hotel would require extensive renovations to add modern plumbing and electrical systems. A school would need fire safety upgrades that would destroy the historic interiors. A private club had no membership base in a town whose year-round population was modest and whose summer population was declining. The house was too specific, too tied to a particular moment and a particular form of social organization, to be easily repurposed. The costs continued regardless. The roof required maintenance to prevent leaks. The heating system, even running at minimal capacity during winter, consumed fuel that was expensive during wartime rationing. The grounds needed attention to prevent the gardens from returning to wild growth. Harold paid these costs because abandoning the property entirely would have been worse: vandalism, accelerated decay, eventual condemnation by the town. But the expenditure was not sustainable. The house was draining resources without providing anything in return except the preservation of a structure that no longer served any function beyond its own existence. By 1950, Harold had stopped visiting. The house remained technically in Vanderbilt ownership, but it was managed remotely, through caretakers who filed reports on necessary repairs and expenses that continued to accumulate. The property taxes alone were significant, based on assessments that reflected the house's original construction cost rather than its current market value, which was effectively zero. Newport's town government had no interest in reducing those assessments. The taxes funded municipal services, and wealthy estates were expected to contribute regardless of whether they were occupied. The situation was untenable, but resolution required someone willing to accept responsibility for a property that had become a burden. Harold was reluctant to make that decision, not out of sentimentality but out of recognition that any decision would be criticized. Demolition would be condemned as vandalism, destruction of an architectural landmark. Sale would require finding a buyer willing to accept obligations that made no economic sense. Donation would mean transferring the liability to another party who might be even less capable of maintaining it. The paralysis was structural, built into the nature of the house itself: too important to demolish, too expensive to maintain, too specific to repurpose. The house continued to deteriorate. Not catastrophically, but incrementally. Water penetrated the roof through small cracks that would have been repaired immediately if the house had been occupied. The penetration caused damage to ceilings, walls, plaster that had been installed with techniques no longer practiced and could not be easily replicated. The heating system, used minimally, developed inefficiencies that increased fuel consumption without providing adequate warmth. Pipes froze in unheated sections, causing damage that required replacement of systems that had been custom designed for the house and could not be replaced with standard materials. The Preservation Society of Newport County, established in 1945, began monitoring the situation. The society had been formed specifically to address the problem Harold and other Vanderbilts faced: houses that were architecturally and historically significant but economically unsustainable as private residences. The model they proposed was pragmatic. They would acquire houses that families could no longer maintain, convert them to museums, and fund operations through admission fees and donations. It was not preservation in any pure sense. It was salvage, an attempt to prevent demolition by transforming private monuments into public commodities. The society approached Harold in the early 1950s. The initial conversations were exploratory, assessing whether he would consider donation or sale at a price that reflected the house's actual market value rather than its symbolic importance. Harold was receptive, but the negotiations were complex. The house had been in the family for 60 years. Disposing of it meant acknowledging that the Vanderbilt era in Newport had ended, that the houses his grandparents had built as declarations of permanence could not be sustained by the generations that inherited them. The acknowledgement was painful, not emotionally but practically. It meant accepting a form of defeat. The younger Vanderbilts were less conflicted. They had grown up in a different era, had been educated during the Depression, had served in the military during the war. They understood wealth differently than their grandparents had, less as something to display and more as something to protect. The houses in Newport were not assets. They were drains on capital that could be deployed more productively elsewhere. They wanted the properties resolved, transferred, removed from family responsibility. Harold was slower to reach that conclusion, but by the late 1950s, he recognized it was inevitable. Other Newport cottages had already been demolished. The society had acquired a few, opened them to tourists, proven that the model could generate revenue sufficient to cover operating costs if not full restoration. Marble House would be different. It was larger than most, more expensive to maintain, more symbolically loaded because of Alva's role in both Gilded Age society and the suffrage movement. But those factors also made it potentially more valuable as a tourist attraction, a house that could draw visitors interested in architecture, social history, and women's political organizing. Harold agreed to sell in 1963. The price was $85,000, less than 2% of what Alva had spent building it 70 years earlier. The figure reflected reality. Marble House had no market value as a residence. Its value was entirely symbolic, dependent on the society's willingness to assume responsibility for maintenance and operation. The society paid what they could afford, which was very little, but the payment was less important than the transfer of liability. Harold was released from an obligation he could no longer sustain. The society acquired a property they believed they could monetize. The transaction was completed quietly, without the publicity that had accompanied the house's construction. Harold did not attend the closing. He signed documents remotely, transferred title, and withdrew from any further involvement with Newport. He spent the remainder of his life in New York and Rhode Island, managing investments, sailing, playing bridge. He died in 1999, 64 years after Alva, having lived long enough to see Marble House become one of Newport's most visited tourist sites. He never publicly commented on the sale. He had done what was necessary, what the economics of the situation required. The house survived, but not as a Vanderbilt property. That era was finished. The family withdrew from Newport entirely within a decade. Other properties were sold, donated, or demolished. The Vanderbilt name remained attached to houses now operated as museums, but the family itself was gone, dispersed to other locations, other activities, other forms of wealth management that did not require maintaining palaces built by ancestors who believed their fortunes would last forever. The withdrawal was not dramatic. It was simply rational, the recognition that preservation without purpose was unsustainable, and that survival sometimes required abandoning what could no longer be carried. The Preservation Society opened Marble House to the public in the summer of 1963, 3 months after acquiring it from Harold Vanderbilt. The preparations were minimal. The house had been maintained sufficiently to prevent structural collapse, but it had not been occupied in any meaningful sense for decades. Rooms were cleaned, furniture uncovered, basic safety measures installed, fire extinguishers, exit signs, rope barriers to control visitor movement. The society did not attempt comprehensive restoration. They did not have the resources. What they had was a structure that could be opened immediately, that would generate revenue immediately, and that could be restored incrementally as funds allowed. The admission price was $2. Visitors were guided through a predetermined route that included the Gold Room, the dining room, the library, and several bedrooms. The tour lasted approximately 30 minutes. Docents provided basic historical information, construction dates, cost figures, the names of architects and owners. The narrative was simplified, focused on spectacle rather than complexity. Visitors were told that Marble House cost $11 million to build, that Alva Vanderbilt was a prominent suffragist, that the house represented the peak of Gilded Age excess. The information was accurate but incomplete, designed to impress rather than complicate. The society's model was straightforward. They were operating a business, not a memorial. The house needed to generate sufficient revenue to cover operating expenses, staff salaries, utilities, insurance, basic maintenance. Any surplus would be allocated to restoration projects that would enhance the visitor experience and justify raising admission prices. The goal was self-sustainability. The society received some donor support, but they could not depend on philanthropy alone. The houses had to pay for themselves, or they would be closed. Marble House succeeded immediately. The first summer drew 15,000 visitors, far exceeding projections. The numbers increased annually as tourism in Newport expanded, driven by improved highway access and the growth of automobile ownership. Families driving between New York and Cape Cod began including Newport as a stop, drawn by advertisements that promised access to Gilded Age mansions. The society marketed aggressively, placing ads in travel magazines, working with tour operators, developing promotional materials that emphasized the houses as historical attractions rather than private residences. The revenue allowed for gradual improvements. The society hired conservators to assess damage and prioritize restoration work. The Gold Room required extensive attention, the gilding had deteriorated, the ceiling painting had faded, the floor needed refinishing. The work was expensive, requiring specialists trained in historical restoration techniques that were rarely used in modern construction. The society funded it through a combination of admission revenue, donations targeted specifically for restoration, and grants from foundations interested in architectural preservation. The restoration was not archaeological. The society was not attempting to return the house to its exact 1892 condition. They were creating a version of the house that would appeal to mid-20th century tourists who expected certain amenities and visual standards. Modern lighting was installed, concealed where possible but functional. Climate control systems were added to protect furnishings from humidity and temperature fluctuations. Bathrooms were renovated to meet contemporary codes. The changes were pragmatic, necessary for operating the house as a public venue, but they altered the building in ways that were irreversible. The furniture presented its own challenges. Much of the original contents had been removed by Alva or sold after her death. The society acquired period-appropriate pieces to fill the rooms, items that matched the style and scale of what had been there but were not original to the house. The distinction mattered to historians but not to tourists, who could not tell the difference between authentic Vanderbilt furniture and similar pieces acquired decades later. The society was constructing a plausible version of the past, accurate enough to be defensible, impressive enough to justify the admission price. The narrative provided to visitors evolved as the society refined its presentation. Early tours emphasized wealth and excess, appealing to visitors who wanted to marvel at the scale of Gilded Age spending. By the 1970s, the narrative expanded to include Alva's suffrage work, positioning Marble House as a site of political organizing rather than simply conspicuous consumption. The shift reflected changing cultural values. Excess alone was no longer sufficient to draw crowds. The house needed a progressive narrative, a story that allowed visitors to feel they were learning about social progress rather than simply gawking at wealth. The Chinese tea house became central to this revised narrative. The society restored it in the 1980s, reopening it as part of the tour and emphasizing its role in suffrage organizing. Docents described the meetings Alva had hosted, the speeches delivered, the women who had gathered there to plan political strategy. The story was accurate, but it was also selective. The tea house had been used for suffrage meetings for roughly 15 years. It had existed for decades before that as a decorative pavilion, and it existed now as a tourist attraction. The suffrage narrative gave it purpose, made it more than ornamental, but the purpose was assigned retrospectively by people who needed the building to mean something beyond what it was. The society also began renting Marble House for private events. Weddings were particularly lucrative. The Gold Room could accommodate ceremonies, the grounds could host receptions, and couples were willing to pay significant fees for the privilege of using a space associated with wealth and historical importance. The rentals generated revenue that admission fees alone could not provide, but they also required compromises. Events meant increased wear on floors, furniture, and finishes. They meant managing caterers, photographers, guests who treated the house as a venue rather than a museum. The society established rules: no open flames, no modifications to the space, insurance requirements, but enforcement was difficult. Damage occurred. Repairs were necessary. The house was being used, which meant it was being worn down. By the 1990s, Marble House was receiving over 100,000 visitors annually. The admission price had increased to $25, a figure that placed it among the more expensive historic house tours in the country. The society justified the cost by pointing to restoration work, expanded programming, and the expertise of docents who could answer detailed questions about architecture and history. But the price also functioned as a filter, attracting tourists who could afford premium experiences and excluding those who could not. The house, built to enforce social hierarchy, continued to enforce hierarchy through economics. The gift shop was installed in the former servants' quarters, a decision that was practical but symbolically revealing. The spaces where staff had lived and worked, small rooms, narrow hallways, utilitarian fixtures, were now used to sell merchandise. Postcards, books, reproductions of decorative objects, all marketed as souvenirs of a visit to Marble House. The shop was profitable, generating revenue per square foot that exceeded the admission fees. Visitors who might resist paying $30 for a tour would spend $15 on items they did not need, purchases justified as mementos of an experience they wanted to remember. The Preservation Society's success with Marble House enabled the acquisition of additional properties. Other cottages along Bellevue Avenue were purchased, restored, open to tourists. The society became the dominant institution managing Newport's architectural heritage, operating multiple houses through a centralized administrative structure that reduced costs and maximized revenue. Marble House remained the flagship property, the most visited, the most photographed, the house that appeared most frequently in marketing materials. It had become a brand, recognizable beyond Newport, associated with the Gilded Age in ways that transcended its specific history. But the operation remained precarious. The houses required constant maintenance: roofs, plumbing, electrical systems, all installed decades earlier and prone to failure. Restoration projects were never complete. Each intervention revealed additional problems, additional costs. The society operated on thin margins, balancing revenue against expenses that could not be deferred without risking structural damage. They had saved the houses from demolition, but they had not eliminated the fundamental problem. Buildings of this scale require enormous resources to maintain, and those resources must come from somewhere. The funding sources diversified over time. Federal historic preservation grants became available in the 1970s, providing support for specific projects. State tourism boards contributed marketing funds, recognizing that the cottages drew visitors who spent money throughout Rhode Island. Private donors established endowments for specific purposes: conservation, education, archival research. But the core revenue remained admission fees and event rentals, which meant the houses had to continuously attract visitors in sufficient numbers to justify their preservation. The society marketed aggressively, developing programs designed to appeal to different audiences. Educational tours for school groups, specialty tours focused on architecture or decorative arts, evening events that allowed visitors to experience the houses with different lighting and ambience. Each program generated revenue and required staff, coordination, insurance, marketing. The operation had become complex, professionalized, dependent on systems that bore little resemblance to the household management that had sustained the houses during their original occupancy. Marble House survived, but survival had required transformation. It was no longer a private residence. It was no longer a headquarters for political organizing. It was a heritage site, a tourist attraction, a venue for events, a brand. The preservation was real, the structure remained intact, the decorative programs were maintained, the historical significance was acknowledged. But the house had been severed from the systems that created it, isolated from the economic and social networks that had once made it functional. What remained was architecture without context, beauty without purpose, a monument maintained not because it mattered but because it could be monetized. The society had solved the problem Harold Vanderbilt could not solve, but the solution was not preservation in any pure sense. It was conversion, the transformation of private excess into public commodity, the monetization of history as a resource that could be extracted, packaged, and sold to visitors who would pay for brief access to a world that no longer existed. The conservators return every few years, their visits scheduled according to deterioration rates that can be predicted but not prevented. They arrive with equipment designed to measure moisture levels in plaster, to assess the stability of gilding, to document cracks in marble that widen imperceptibly but continuously. Their reports are technical, precise, listing interventions required to maintain surfaces that were never designed to be maintained indefinitely. The gold room needs regilding. The dining room marble shows stress fractures. The roof membrane requires replacement. Each project costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each project delays the next crisis without preventing it. The house is structurally sound, a phrase repeated often in preservation literature, in donor reports, in applications for grants. But structural soundness is not the same as vitality. The walls stand. The roof holds. The floors support weight. But nothing lives here. The rooms are occupied 8 hours daily during tourist season, empty the rest of the time. The furniture sits in positions determined by curatorial decisions rather than use. The lighting is controlled to prevent fading, which means the rooms are dimmer than they were when occupied, shadows accumulating in corners that were once illuminated by chandeliers burning continuously during a house designed for 50 people, family, guests, staff, now operates with a rotating crew of docents, security personnel, maintenance workers who arrive in morning and leave at closing. Their presence is transactional. They are employed to facilitate tours, to protect the property, to perform repairs. They do not inhabit the house in any meaningful sense. They do not eat in the dining room, sleep in the bedrooms, gather in the gold room for conversations that extend past midnight. The house was built for those activities, its scale and organization designed to accommodate the complex choreography of Gilded Age social life. Without that choreography, the spaces feel wrong, too large, too formal, designed for performances that no longer occur. The tourists sense this without necessarily articulating it. They move through the prescribed route, pausing where docents indicate, photographing what is permitted, absorbing information about cost and craftsmanship and historical significance. But they are observers, not participants. The velvet ropes ensure that. So does the alarm system, the surveillance cameras, the staff members who watch for anyone who touches a surface or steps beyond designated boundaries. The house is visible but inaccessible, present but remote, a stage set where the fourth wall has been reinforced with technology and regulation. Most dispersed to other employment when the house closed, their names unrecorded, their later lives unknown. Why did the family abandon it? Because maintaining it became economically irrational, though that phrasing is rarely used. Could anyone live here now? Technically yes, practically no. The systems are inadequate for year-round occupation, the costs would be prohibitive, and zoning restrictions prevent residential use. The house is preserved as a museum because that is the only viable option, not because it is the ideal option. The Preservation Society does not emphasize these limitations. Their marketing focuses on spectacle, on the opportunity to experience a world of wealth and elegance that has vanished. The language is carefully constructed to suggest that the house represents something aspirational rather than something cautionary. Visitors are encouraged to imagine themselves in Alva's position, hosting dinners in the Gold Room, taking tea in the Chinese tea house, living lives of leisure and refinement. The fantasy is absurd. Most visitors could not afford a single room in Marble House, let alone the entire structure, but the fantasy is what they are paying for. The events business reinforces this. Weddings at Marble House allow couples to perform wealth they do not possess, to stage ceremonies in a setting that suggests dynastic marriage alliances rather than contemporary romance. The Gold Room becomes a backdrop for photographs that will be shared on social media, images that communicate status through association with a building that represents the pinnacle of historical excess. The house facilitates this performance, provides the setting, collects the fee. The irony is structural. A house built to exclude now profits from temporary inclusion, charging people to occupy spaces that were designed to deny them access. The preservation is meticulous but necessarily selective. The society maintains what is visible, what tourists see during the 30-minute tour. The Gold Room is pristine. The dining room marble gleams. The entrance hall impresses with its scale and materials. But the servants' quarters are minimally maintained, closed to tours except during specialty events, their condition adequate to prevent collapse but not to represent how those spaces functioned. The kitchens are similarly neglected, visible only through doorways, their equipment outdated and non-functional. The infrastructure, plumbing, heating, electrical, is maintained to code but not to historical accuracy. Modern systems have been installed where original systems failed, compromises made in the name of safety and efficiency. These choices reflect economic reality. The society has limited resources and must allocate them strategically. They preserve what generates revenue, the spectacular rooms, the famous spaces, the areas that justify the admission price. The utilitarian spaces, the infrastructure, the systems that actually made the house functional, receive attention only when failure is imminent. This creates a version of Marble House that is beautiful but incomplete, impressive but dishonest, preserved in ways that obscure how the house actually operated when it was occupied. The docents learn a script, a narrative refined over decades to communicate essential information in the time available. They describe Alva's ambition, the cost of construction, the architectural references, the suffrage meetings. They do not discuss labor disputes on the railroads that generated Vanderbilt wealth, or the workers who quarried the marble, or the servants who cleaned the 50 rooms. Those subjects complicate the narrative, introduce questions that cannot be answered in 30 minutes, and risk alienating visitors who came for spectacle rather than critique. The script is not false, but it is strategic, designed to educate without challenging, to inform without implicating. The house has become what preservation creates when separation from original purpose is complete, a beautiful corpse, maintained at great expense, admired by thousands, understood by few. It survives because survival has been monetized, because the architecture can be converted into revenue sufficient to justify the costs of maintenance. But the survival is hollow. The house no longer serves the function it was built to serve. It cannot. That function depended on systems, social, economic, political, that no longer exist. What remains is form without content, structure without purpose, preservation without continuity. The question of whether this matters is not rhetorical. The house is open to the public, accessible to people who would never have been permitted entry when it functioned as a private residence. The suffrage narrative allows visitors to connect the building to political progress, to see it as more than a monument to excess. The preservation has prevented demolition, maintained architectural and decorative elements that would otherwise be lost. These are not trivial achievements. They represent decades of effort by people who believed the house was worth saving. But the house is not what it was. It cannot be. The transformation required to make it survive has altered it fundamentally. The Vanderbilts built Marble House to announce dominance, to prove that their fortune had transcended its industrial origins and achieved something approaching European aristocratic permanence. They failed. The fortune contracted, the family withdrew, the house became a liability they could not sustain. The Preservation Society succeeded where the Vanderbilts failed, but their success required abandoning the purpose the house was built to serve. They saved the architecture by destroying the system that made the architecture meaningful. This is what preservation does when it operates without alternatives. It isolates objects from contexts, protects structures by severing them from the economic and social networks that created them. Marble House stands, but it stands alone, disconnected from the railroads that funded it, from the labor that built it, from the social hierarchies it was designed to enforce. The house is maintained by professionals who understand conservation techniques but did not experience the world the house was built to dominate. The tourists who visit are separated by a century from the people who commissioned it, by class from the people who built it, by the velvet ropes from the spaces they are permitted to observe but not inhabit. The conservators will return. They will document new damage, propose new interventions, submit new budgets. The society will fundraise, will allocate resources, will perform the work necessary to prevent collapse. The tourists will continue to arrive, to pay admission, to photograph the gold room, to imagine lives they will never live. The house will continue to operate, generating revenue, employing staff, fulfilling its function as a heritage site and tourist attraction. The preservation will continue because the preservation has become self-sustaining, justified by its own existence rather than by any connection to what the house was originally built to be. But the hollowness remains. It is audible in the silence between tour groups, visible in the empty rooms after closing, present in the gap between the house as it appears and the house as it functioned. Marble House was built to be inhabited, to be used, to serve as the stage for social performance that would establish Vanderbilt dominance in a society that had excluded them. That performance ended. The stage remains. The ropes keep visitors at a distance, but even without the ropes, the distance would exist. No one can inhabit this house the way it was designed to be inhabited. The systems that supported that kind of occupation, the servants, the social rituals, the economic extraction that funded it all, are gone. What survives is architecture, beautiful and expensive and fundamentally empty, maintained not because it matters but because it has been converted into a commodity that can be sold to people who pay to observe what they cannot possess. This is not tragedy. It is simply aftermath. Buildings outlast the purposes they were built to serve. They survive by adaptation or they do not survive at all. Marble House adapted by becoming something else entirely, by accepting transformation as the price of continued existence. The house Alva built no longer exists, not really. What exists is a version of that house, carefully maintained, strategically presented, monetized and managed by an organization that understands preservation as a business rather than a mission. The house survives, but it survives as something other than itself, a monument to wealth that profits from its own display, a symbol of power that exists now only as symbol, emptied of everything except its capacity to be observed, photographed, and forgotten by the next group of visitors already lining up at the entrance.